Okay, so we have been covering a lot about the format of a podcast on this channel. We've talked about what it looks like to format a podcast for solo podcasters. One of our recent videos was about your podcast intro. So today I'm excited to talk about your podcast outro. So let's get right to it. Hey y'all, Crystal here today. So like I said in the beginning, we've really been talking a lot about formatting your podcast, whether it's for solo podcast or interview podcast. And today I want to talk about the outro because the podcast introduction is super important. The middle, right, the meat of the episode is just as important, but we're really going to focus on the podcast outro. I like to tell the students and members in my community that you're hosting a great party, right? That's what your podcast is. Isn't it more fun to think about it like a party? And as the host of this party, you gotta walk people out the door. I love the idea of you don't just shut off the lights and then tell everybody to get out of your house, right? If you're hosting a party, you kind of say, all right, guys, we're winding down, last call, whatever that looks like for you. And that's really what the podcast outro as well. So I have 4 elements of a great podcast outro that I'm going to share with you here today. So if you've already watched this video right here, all about your podcast format, then you're going to be familiar with what I'm going to call wrap it up. This is number 1, okay? Of the 4 elements, you gotta wrap it up. What does this mean? It means that you got to let people know that you're done teaching or talking in the interview or whatever the end of the main portion of your podcast is, but you got to do something to wrap it up at the end. And that actually brings me into my second point already, and that is, how can you wrap it up? With a great recap. Okay, this is going to look different for different people. Maybe you have a podcast where you're educating people. So you have we covered the 5 points of whatever it is. And here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you would recap all of the different stages of what you talked about in your podcast. Or maybe you did an interview and you say, oh my gosh, didn't you love it when my guest talked about, and maybe you could go into the number 1 takeaway that you had from the conversation with that person, but you got to wrap it up and then you got to do a quick recap if it's relevant to your podcast episode. And the third element that I want you to include in your podcast outro is a call to action or self-sponsored ad. So we've talked about self-sponsored ads before and calls to action. So if you haven't, make sure you check out these videos right here that will help you kind of dive into more of the examples that you can use and what they actually are. But basically a call to action is inviting people to take the next step with you, to go on a further journey. And a self-sponsored ad is you plugging something that revolves around your business or something else that you're trying to promote online. So for me, I may wrap up an episode by saying, well, that does it for this episode. So, and here's my call to action. So make sure you go check out the show notes at crystalproffitt.com/episode 201. Or I could do a self-sponsored ad. But that does it for this episode. So make sure you go sign up for my brand new free masterclass where you will find it at, and then I would input the URL. So that's an example of a call to action or a self-sponsored ad. Now, you can do both, and there's nothing to say that you couldn't have these call to actions or self-sponsored ad in the introduction of your show. But we are specifically talking about the outro today. So I want to make sure that if you haven't put a call to action in the very beginning or in the middle, you got to do it at the end. And you'll learn from the video that is all about calls to action, but one of the easiest things that you can ask your people to do is subscribe and leave a rating and a review. You can have that in every single episode, but every single podcast outro needs to have a call to action or self-sponsored ad. So I want you to tell me in the comments below if you already have a way that you're ending your podcast episodes now and you're just here for some ideas and inspiration, or if you haven't launched your podcast at all and you're just trying to figure out all the elements that go into it. So tell me in the comments below, launched, not launched. That way I'll know who is here watching videos on this channel. Okay, let's get back to the video. And the fourth element to consider for your podcast outro is 100% optional, but music. I like it whenever I listen to a podcast and they have music at the end. Maybe they don't have music anywhere else during the entire episode, but there's music at the end because it's like, okay, like they're wrapping it up. Like I think in my mind, like, okay, this is the end. It's about to be over. Because most of the time I'm listening to podcasts whenever I'm out running, I'm walking the dog, I'm taking my son to the park. So I'll have my phone somewhere else. But if I hear the music, it's like a trigger. It's a cue to be like, oh, okay, this episode's going to end soon. So maybe I need to listen to something else, or I'm done. I'm just going to put my phone away. But I want you to have music in the outro of your podcast if that is something that works with you and your audience. But that does it for today. So I hope that you are inspired to kind of jazz up your podcast outro, or you were given some ideas for how you could create a podcast format that works for you and your audience. But again, I want you to tell me in the comments below whether you've already launched your podcast or you haven't launched yet, so I can continue to create content for the people that are here watching videos on this channel. But if you have not already, I encourage you to subscribe and give us a thumbs up on this video telling us that you enjoyed this. Make sure that you check out these other videos right here, all about podcasting and running your online business. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.